Welcome to the EchoCast for the last time. More on that shortly. It's not what you think. A podcast about video game news, speculation, rumors, and reviews. I am your host, Morgan, aka Bon Diesel, and this week I'll be covering big changes coming to the podcast, Starfield review codes out in the wild, some Mass Effect 4 quote-unquote news, and much more. A few things before we get started. Subscribe to the show on your favorite podcast platform and on YouTube. Please subscribe to the channel, hit the like button, and comment with your thoughts, questions for next week, or to just say hello. A special thank you to all of my patrons, including producer level patrons Hassan and Horseman, supporter level patrons PK, The Dawn, Cade Nephilim, and Neuronix, as well as viewer level patron Zinra. If you're interested in supporting this podcast and getting ad-free episodes for as little as $1 per month, please check out patreon.com/bondiesel. Gaming news. This week we have 8 topics. And first, we're going to kick it off with the podcast changes. I typically save content updates for the end, but this is a big one, so let's talk about it. I'm not ending the podcast. It's not going anywhere, maybe against better judgment at times. But what I did decide, it was actually inspired by a tweet I had received from someone who said, maybe rebrand. And my first reaction was like, no, it's been the EchoCast forever. It's the EchoCast. And then the more I thought about it and the more I was kind of thinking, I was like, man, that's not a bad idea. The thing about the EchoCast is it started in 2018. It's getting to be, at this point, it's around 5.5 years old. And for the first 3 years or so, I never missed a week. I had an episode every single week for a really long time. Then life intervened, a baby, COVID, so on and so forth. And what happened a couple years ago is I decided to make it a more general gaming podcast. If you're newer to the podcast, especially in the last year or two, you may not know that this podcast, even though I've talked about it, started off as a Division 1 podcast, The Division by Ubisoft. I was, and I still am, a huge fan of that franchise. And that actually is where I got started with my content creation, or whatever you want to call this stuff that we do. And, through various means and ways, I got to know people on the dev team, people in the community development side of things. It started off with screenshots I would post on Twitter and build guides, believe it or not, that I did. And then I started streaming, and I started streaming with some other people who were fairly well known in that community. And it got to the point where I was like, I have a voice. I want to talk. I think people will listen. And they did. And the podcast has never been huge. It got big, at least from my context, around the release of Division 2. It peaked at a few thousand listens an episode for a while, a good while actually. And then it fell off as the Division 2 kind of, slowed down, and as that game situation developed. And I changed some of the branding and the colors of the podcast, the logos, and obviously the content. Now, if you listen every week, you'll know that I talk about the Division relatively often. You just have to realize that for multiple years, every episode I recorded was only the Division. And, during the lead up to Division 2, there was normally always something to talk about, or at least speculate on. But that, slowly faded. After Division 2 came out, content wasn't coming out super fast for that. A Division 3 is many, many years out, which I will obviously talk about when that becomes a thing. But I've really enjoyed making this kind of a general podcast. I actually remember the first episode that wasn't a Division only episode, and it was the week that the Mass Effect Legendary Edition came out for the original trilogy, the remaster. That was the week. That I enjoyed that experience so much. It made me decide to ditch the Division only podcast. And it was rough going for a minute. You could tell people weren't a big fan of the change. My listens dropped down to low double digits for a short minute, and then climb back up to where they are now, where it's, like low-ish, medium, triple digits, which is fine with me. Again, if this was supposed to be my career, I would obviously probably give it up, but it's a hobby. I enjoy talking. And that kind of takes me to the rebrand. So starting next week with the 250th episode, this is 249 that you're listening to now. This podcast will be rebranded from the EchoCast, a video game podcast, to the Bonfire, a video game podcast. And this name came directly from J-Lorg. At least that's the name that I know him by. He's an Ubisoft massive dev that's working on the Avatar game, I believe. And my original idea was like the Bond cast and things like that, which would have been fine. And that's what I was going to go with. I had already started on branding and stuff for that. And then I posted it to my Twitter, and he dropped that just like perfect name for the podcast. And the reason I like it is because this podcast, being a solo podcast, if you don't listen to a lot of other podcasts, you may not know, but solo podcasts are not only not very common, I think they're basically non-existent. Most podcasts have co-hosts or interview someone every single week. And I would love to do those things. I would love to have a co-host. I would love to interview someone every week. But the simple fact is that with a full-time job, a family, especially a young child, the fact that I do like to make videos and stream and do stuff other than this podcast, it's just not realistic for me to always have a guest on or coordinate with a co-host. I record this podcast roughly every Friday evening, but it and then it goes up early on Patreon, but sometimes I record at 9 at night. Sometimes I record at 2 in the afternoon. Sometimes I record at 11 o'clock at night. It just depends on what's going on. Sometimes it's Saturday morning. And I just simply can't expect a co-host to deal with that, one. And two, guests are hard enough to schedule anyways. If you go through my catalog, I have interviewed a decent number of people. But doing it every week is just not realistic for me. So I like the Bonfire, again, getting back to that, because this podcast in my head is kind of like me just sitting around talking to some friends. And it's obviously a one-sided conversation. A big focus I want to have after this rebrand is really, really pushing the whole idea of getting feedback and getting questions or commentary from the people who do listen, because it's a decent number of people. It's it's a few hundred people who listen every week, and the last time I looked, something like my retention is like something like, I'd have to look again, but it was like 75 to 80% of people listen all the way to the very end, and like that's pretty good. I'll take it. That's pretty awesome. And obviously I would love if thousands of people listen to this every week, and maybe we can work our way up to there one day. It's already been 5 years, so we'll see. But it's cool to know that the people who do listen really listen. And so if you're listening right now, thank you. You're the reason that this isn't the end of the EchoCast, but it's a new beginning for the Bonfire. So I really want to push kind of a cozy feel. I'm probably going to change up the background music and stuff, if you can even hear it. I've actually never gotten any feedback on that. There should be background music that's very quiet, but you'd probably have to be listening to it pretty loud to hear it. I'll be switching some of that stuff up more than likely to try to give a little bit different of a feel. I probably need to change like the intro music and stuff like that and the outro, which is a bummer because the intro song is something that someone custom made, obviously inspired the Division. It's by the Division. It's, if you listen, it's not an actual Division track. It is a original track someone made for me literally like 4 years ago. And I'll have to figure that stuff out. So, you know, there will be a transition period here. So some things may not change, but most will. I'm going to update the Twitter. I have a Threads account ready for the bonfire. I have the Instagram account ready. I'll obviously be changing the branding and such of the cover art and of the actual podcast itself. I'm going to do it a day or two after this episode releases, so people see this episode and recognize it, and then we'll go into that transition. So it may be a little weird for a minute. I'm a little afraid I'm going to get some D-subs from people. But hopefully not. Hopefully people listen and understand what's going on. I think the last big thing I'm excited about with it is that I feel like kind of renaming this, and I can kind of bring it more into the branding of my YouTube channel and my streaming and stuff like that. I feel like the podcast has always been such a separate venture from that because it's got completely different branding. Its name is separate entirely. There's no connection. Now it's, Bond Diesel on everything, and then the bonfire for the podcast. And one homage to the Division I do plan on doing is, at least for the time being, doing the Division orange, like the official color or close to it, for most of my branding and the logo and so on. So you may notice that that's my little homage to the Division where this podcast began, and I guess a way for me to, in my head, not forget my roots and where this podcast began. So that's what's going on with that. If you have any questions, commentary, thoughts, let me know in all the usual places, in the YouTube comments, in the Discord. There is a Linktree link in the comment, down in the comments, or down in the description of the podcast or the video. And you can go there and find all the places that you can get a hold of me. I think my email address is even in there, or you can get it on YouTube. So let me know what you're thinking. I'm open, ears are open. I'm happy to get feedback, and I'm excited to have a little change. I just think that the bonfire is just such a good name, man. It makes me feel, I hate that I didn't think of it myself, and luckily I got it in writing that Jay's okay with me using it, so he can't pull back on me now. Getting into some actual gaming news, the second story here is Starfield review codes are out in the wild. So the first thing I will confirm is that I do not have a code. I'm signed up on the Bethesda press portal. I harassed all of the Bethesda North American PR people and got a response, and they gave me the link to a Google form where you sign up and request a review code, and that did not come through, unfortunately. So supposedly I've seen rumors that they're putting these things out in waves, so there's a chance that maybe I'll be someone who gets it closer to the actual release of the game. It's fine either way. I would love to have been able to do like I think it's the 31st at noon Eastern time is when those reviews, the embargo lifts. I would love to be one of the people that gets to release my video or a special podcast or something. And if I get access early in these waves or something, I will still do that. But if it doesn't happen, that's fine. I'm really hyped for Starfield. I really think, I really believe that this game is, kind of getting slept on a little bit, which is funny because I've seen people be like, oh, the hype for this game is too much. I'm like, I actually think the hype is kind of low key. If you think about what it is, it's a current gen or next gen, whatever you want to call it, Bethesda title that's a mainline game. Obviously, everyone dunks on Fallout 76, even though it was kind of a weird spin-off side project thing, and it had issues when it came out, but it's actually pretty good now. It's a new IP from Bethesda for the first time in a really long time, and it's a space action adventure RPG that's made by Bethesda. That's gonna have those Bethesda quirks and charms and stuff. Like, I just really, and it's not because Baldur's Gate 3 came out, a few weeks ago. I don't think that's why people are sleeping on it. Unfortunately, I really do believe a big part of the not lack of hype. There is hype, but I think it's because it's an Xbox game now. That obviously has soured a lot of people, and I get it. I understand that probably sucks if you're a PlayStation gamer. I have a little less sympathy knowing that, the rumors are, or at least that Sony was trying to lock up Starfield for itself as an exclusive, and knowing that even though it's an Xbox exclusive, it's going to be day and day on PC. And if it was a Sony exclusive, it wouldn't be on PC for a year or more. So I'm glad that worked out the way it did. Obviously, it would probably be best if it was its own, it was multi-platform and it wasn't restricted. But I also believe, and I think that Todd Howard has even confirmed this, the lead on the game and of Bethesda, that I'm fairly certain if Starfield was a Bethesda property completely still, it probably would have been out like a year and a half ago, and it probably would have been a crap show when it came out. It eventually would have been awesome, but I really do think that Xbox kind of probably put the reins on them a little bit and said, hey, this thing needs to come out in like proper condition, right? Like, we can't do the normal Bethesda jank thing where it comes out, modders fix the game first, then the devs come through and fix it eventually, and then they go from there. And then you have a Skyrim or Fallout 3 or even Fallout 4, where, they're pretty beloved years later, but, their releases were always a bit weird. So yeah, Starfield, those codes are out in the wild. The 31st at noon Eastern time is when they're going to be able to drop their reviews. One of the funny things I've seen is Paris Lilly, who's part of Kind of Funny and Gamertag Radio, I believe. He tweeted that he had a code and he was playing, and then I still think hasn't tweeted like more than 24 hours later. And so I think actually he did this morning, and it was like a gif of someone waking up and looking all rattled, and playing it. He was up all night playing Starfield. So they're all gonna tease all these people who have codes. They're not gonna reveal anything of substance, because that's, they signed an NDA. They can't do that. There are spoilers out there. I've been avoiding everything. I feel like I know enough about Starfield that I'm super hyped for it, but I know so little. I don't really know like how the game's going to start, how it's going to go. I don't feel like I know anything about the story, and maybe that's not just me, maybe that's everyone. But I just this is cool, man. It's a big deal, and I don't think it's really gonna hit until it comes out, right? My honest prediction is that I think it's gonna end up being probably like a 90 Metacritic score. I've seen, there's been pundits and journalists saying for years now, like, oh, this game better be a 10 out of 10 or else Xbox is blah blah. Like, no, that's not true. An 8 out of 10 for this game would be acceptable, but a little underwhelming. I think a 9 out of 10 is the goal, and early whisperings and stuff seem to indicate that may be realistic. Obviously like a 9.5 or a 10 out of 10 from any outlets really would be really cool, and it may be possible. So we'll have to see. Yeah. So I'm still hoping, I still have hope that I may end up getting a code. I'm not counting on it at this point, but it would be pretty awesome. And if I do, I will be able to say I have one, but that's obviously it. So if you're worried about spoilers, keep your head down, maybe ignore some of the places that those tend to crop up for the next couple weeks. And then, jump in on the 31st, or I think it's the 5th when it actually comes out. And we'll get to, dive into this awesome new game. The third story is just kind of my ongoing thoughts about Baldur's Gate 3. I am I think the beginning stages of the third act. And honestly, I've lost a little bit of interest. It's nothing to do with the game. I've been enjoying the Tarkov, new wipe, the new update. I am getting pretty hyped for Starfield, and that's just like in the back of my mind. I have hit a place in Baldur's Gate where I can tell I'm getting towards the end. But some of the things I want to do before I wrap the game up are proving to be a little beyond my current character's reach. And so I need to do a little bit of leveling, a little bit of grinding, and I don't want to. And so I'm taking a little break. I still intend on finishing at least my first playthrough before Starfield releases. I already have a second character started, which I started on stream. It's a human paladin that I'm actually excited about because the paladin is the most popular class, and the ranger, which I picked, is not. So I'm curious. I'm assuming the paladin is very powerful, and they have the whole oath thing that you have to kind of keep in mind playing as a paladin. That I think will be bring an interesting dynamic. And I think it will make another playthrough one day interesting. I suspect after a few weeks or a month or two of Starfield, with some Tarkov sprinkled in, I will be ready to take a break and play some other games. And I suspect Baldur's Gate 3 is where that's going to come. Even though I have to admit I've been having some Mass Effect cravings lately, so I do have a human-centric playthrough there I need to finish up. So. It looks like my near to medium future is Starfield, Baldur's Gate 3, Tarkov, some Division 2, some Mass Effect, some Battlefield 2042. But Baldur's Gate did have an interesting situation this week where they put out an update and it messed up people's saves like real bad. And so they pulled the update back. Now they've redeployed it and it should be fixed up. But that caused some issues. I think the conversation around Baldur's Gate 3 is interesting because I think you're seeing more and more people getting to Act 3 and getting, other than the freaks who are like, I'm 110 hours in and still in Act 1, you have problems. Like, I'm kind of kidding, but not entirely. I think Act 2 and what I've seen of Act 3 are still like really good. You can just definitely tell that Act 1 got 3 years of player testing and Act 2 and 3 didn't. And so that there's pacing issues, there's various issues like that. There's some characters in the game who aren't very well fleshed out, especially in the second and third act. The general, I've been reading some as non-spoilery as they can be, thoughts on the endings and stuff like that, and that it sounds like the ending of the game is kind of underwhelming, and to say the least. So I think that as that stuff rolls around, you may see the conversation around Baldur's Gate 3 go from like, this is a masterpiece, the greatest game ever made, to I think more people are going to be like, wow, this was like a really, really good game that maybe didn't quite finish as well as people wanted, but is still like excellent and very good and deserving of praise and awards and things like that. So, I've really enjoyed this game. I love the characters. The first love interest I went for was Shadowheart, and I took her down like a good path. There's different long-term situations that she can get into, but it seems like I've taken the like righteous path or the good path with her, and she's become. I've liked her character since the start, but I really like her character now. She's reminds me a lot of Tali from Mass Effect, where she's very sweet. The way that they wrote her character is very endearing and very charming. And she's also like kind of scary, so and capable. So that's kind of what reminds me of Tali. So Baldur's Gate 3, great game. I'm sure I'll probably stop talking about it here fairly soon, if not this week. And but I suspect it'll be cropping up. One thing to know about this dev, at least from what I've seen, it seems like people talking about Baldur's Gate 3 who were fans of Larian Studios' previous games has kind of pointed out like, hey, they tend to release their games in like decent shape but very incomplete. And then about a year or more from now, they'll probably release like a definitive edition of Baldur's Gate 3 that's going to have like the second and third act being a lot more fleshed out, and probably having, more endings, and maybe even more classes that you can play as and stuff. So the people who are fans of this studio seem to be pretty heavily implying like this game, in a year or so, is actually probably going to look quite different, in that it's, the second and third acts that are very good anyways, are probably going to get better, because there's lots of things that they have probably left on the cutting room floor that, at least in previous games, they've added back in once they had time to finish, to the point where Act 3 has multiple really large and detailed locations, and supposedly there's a whole nother location that got cut like literally in the last couple months of the game before it came out, that there was supposed to be this whole other part of the game, and which likely had some expansion of some story and stuff like that for various characters. So I'll be on the lookout for that stuff. I suspect Baldur's Gate 3 is going to be a game that I'll be kind of revisiting here and there over the years, while we wait for story number 4, Mass Effect 4. The news I have for that isn't really news. It is some desperate clickbait. Take anything I can get to talk about Mass Effect. Mike Gamble tweeted this week. And so he had tweeted, I believe, last week about Baldur's Gate 3 and being like, man, this is like so inspirational. This game's amazing. Really kind of throwing out there that, like, at least paraphrasing, but like, yeah, we want to do this. Like, this is awesome. Then this week, Shinobi 602, I believe, is a pretty prominent gaming commentator and OG and very well-known Mass Effect fan. Basically said, posted the trailer from 2020 and was like, I watch this weekly and it gets me hyped, and I'm not afraid to admit it. And Mike Gamble quote tweeted him today, or in the last couple days, and said like, hey, we'll try to do right by you. And then some people asked some questions down in the comments and down in the replies, and there was something like, are we gonna, is Liara happy with where the game, when this next game is taking place? And Gamble gave his typical vague reaction, and then someone asked, like, what's your favorite ship in the Mass Effect franchise? And Gamble responded with, one that you haven't seen yet, which is so cool. Like, they're so good at teasing. Like that game is likely very far away, and they are likely still working on the very most basic parts of that game. But man, they just do such a good job, or at least Mike Gamble does, of just like giving everyone just enough. Like, I made a whole video on it. If you go to YouTube, look for Bon Diesel, I have a video about these tweets, and it's more of doing like an update on what we know about where production is at and stuff like that, or from what we can glean from what we've been told. But it's at the very least, it's showing some confidence. It's showing a little bit of cockiness that I suspect will have some payoff in November when we have N7 Day for 2023. Every N7 Day since they announced this game has given like some significant info. 2022's was like chock full of teasers and things to decipher, which, we're still talking about. And I suspect this next one will be even bigger. I still think they have to hold back a little bit with their teasing and stuff of Mass Effect 4 or whatever they're going to call it, because they likely are still working stuff out. And until Dreadwolf comes out, I think BioWare and EA are going to be reluctant to put the entire focus on Mass Effect, because as they, seemingly finish up Dragon Age Dreadwolf, I think that they want to try to not get in their own way. So we'll have to wait and see how that goes. But I fully expect to, be pretty excited for N7 Day. I think Mike Gamble is doing a great job of teasing us per usual, and I can't wait to get more. Okay, so we're going to take a quick break. Okay, story number 5. My Game of the Year thoughts and predictions after Baldur's Gate 3 and before Starfield. So this one is kind of complicated for me because There's multiple games on the game of the year kind of conversation talking point that I haven't played, and I'm just not gonna play. I'm not gonna play Final Fantasy. I'm not gonna play Spider-Man 2 if it gets that talk. I'm not gonna play Tears of the Kingdom, which I think for most people, at least for since it came out, has been the favorite to win and was kind of the assumed winner, I think, until Baldur's Gate came out. And I'm, still really holding out hope that maybe Starfield can put itself into that conversation as well. We'll have to wait and see for a couple weeks at least. But it's interesting. What I enjoy the most is I'm not like super enthused about Tears of the Kingdom. It's I think if I had any prospect of buying a Switch at this point, I'd maybe be more interested. But my thing is that after the first couple years that the Switch was out, like, it's such a like a Luddite or like just like a dumb take to be like, oh, the Switch sucks. I'm gonna wait for the next one because the next one's probably gonna be outdated too when it comes out. But it's just so hard for me to justify spending a few $100 on like a device that was outdated when it came out like 8 years ago. And so, I don't have a Switch. Tears of the Kingdom, all the streams and the playthroughs I've watched, and I've really enjoyed like learning about the lore and seeing how people are enjoying it and stuff. But it's still just like, to me, and I suspect if my hands got on the game, I would disagree with myself here. It kind of seems like people are excited about like the idea of Zelda and, thinking about like how much they loved Breath of the Wild and how Tears of the Kingdom took things from that game and like made it better, or kept it the same. And to a lot of people, Breath of the Wild is one of, if not the greatest game ever made. And Tears, because it's, a slight improvement or maybe a major improvement over that game, people are kind of giving it that respect as well. But I think my issue is that, when you're selecting a thing like a game of the year, my take on that would be, is I think you have to try to be somewhat objective. If you purely go off subjective feelings, I still think Tears of the Kingdom is going to run away with it. And it's been really interesting. I watch a fair number of podcasts and videos by content creators in the gaming world and stuff. And it's really interesting how, like, one of my biggest gripes is that there's a bunch of games that have come out: Final Fantasy, Baldur's Gate 3, Dead Space, Hi-Fi Rush, all of these games that are like, have been in the talk for game of the year, that like a lot of journalists and stuff that I pay attention to, like, have barely played or haven't played at all, because they're on like their like 250th hour of Tears of the Kingdom. And so a game that you can play that much, that says something about that game. Obviously, you can't dismiss that. But then, like, I definitely think there's going to be some issue with when these conversations happen at places like Giant Bomb, Kind of Funny, MinMax, and all these places, and obviously the Game Awards with Jeff Keighley, who, he polls and gets votes from all over the industry, including Kind of Funny, Giant Bomb, and various journalists and things like that. And that's how he makes his list and gets his winners for his show. But even the individual shows, I think we're going to run into this issue where like for Kind of Funny, Tim Geddes, who's one of the founders of the channel, of that podcast and that group, has straight up just said, like, he loves Tears of the Kingdom, it's his game of the year, and he's not going to play Starfield because it's just not his thing. But it's like, I feel like, and that's fine, that's his deal, that's what he prefers. I'm in the same boat, right? But I'm not a like full-time professional, game commentator who like owns and runs a, pretty well respected gaming podcast where like the game of the year that Kind of Funny puts out, like, it doesn't matter. No one's game of the year, even the Game Awards, like, those awards, like, they kind of don't matter. They're just basically there for like, if it's a game you like, you cheer; if it's a game you didn't like, you boo. But like, the conversations and how they get to game of the year and stuff like that, I still think is interesting. And I hope that those conversations aren't sullied by the fact that like for Kind of Funny, if Tim is on the in the discussion of what game of the year is, well, he can't even talk about Starfield, which, there may be other people on their staff who are going to say like, yeah, this is my game of the year. This game blew my mind. It's amazing. I love it. And does that mean that every single pundit or journalist or commentator has to play every single game? And maybe not for themselves. I think if you're putting out your own game of the year and things like that, but I think if you're going to throw your hat into a conversation about all of the biggest games of the year, then you should have legitimate, genuine experience with all of at least the top contenders. The big issue that we're going to run into here is that there's games like Dredge and Dave the Diver, and for me, Planet of Lana, and some like remakes like Dead Space and Resident Evil 4 and the Metroid game, where some of those indie games in other years might have won Game of the Year this year. Some of those remakes may have won Game of the Year this year. I think Dead Space is fantastic. But I think that when you have so many new, like legitimately new games, you kind of just have to put those games to pasture, because no matter how good they are, they just, in this kind of year, they just can't be part of the conversation. And what I hope for this year is, I don't care who wins all the Game of the Year awards. It's probably going to be Tears of the Kingdom for a bunch of them. I just hope the conversations are like interesting and nuanced. Where like last year, the conversation was like mostly Elden Ring, and then Ragnarok, the God of War sequel, came out, and it kind of shook the boat a little bit, but it was still mostly just like Elden Ring was going to win everything. And like to the point where there were conversations in some of these video game commentator shows and stuff where it was like, okay, we know Elden Ring's number one. Now what's number two? And the conversation for much of 2023 was the same. The conversation in 2023 was very much like, okay, Tears is the winner. What's going to be number two? Like that's the actual competition now. And that's when people were talking about Jedi Survivor, Hi-Fi Rush, the Dead Space remake, the Resident Evil 4 remake, and then Final Fantasy, and then, blah, blah, blah. And what I guess I'll wrap this conversation up with is the thing I think I appreciate the most about Baldur's Gate 3 is that it has I've seen a lot more people in the last month be willing to consider that maybe Tears isn't the de facto winner this year. And I think that whether, they vote for Baldur's Gate 3 or Final Fantasy or Tears or Starfield or Spider-Man 2, that I think that Baldur's Gate 3 shook the boat just enough to get people out of the like Tears of the Kingdom trance that at least some of them are in. And there's more people now for their personal list or even for these big compilation lists who may at least consider a different game. Now, maybe Tears deserves it. I mean, it certainly seems like from a sales perspective, a review perspective, just the way people talk about it perspective, it probably deserves Game of the Year in many cases. But I would just, for selfishly, like the conversation to be more complicated than that. All right, story number 6 is Xbox's new strike system. So Xbox has implemented and talked about a new disciplinary system that has gotten some kind of mixed reviews. And so basically it's a system that you can track. You can log on to their Xbox Live website and see what your situation is. But you basically get 8 strikes before your account is like deactivated. And I've seen some people being like, well, that sure seems lenient. But what I don't think people have understood about it is that, like, if you call someone a butthead, and now there's a voice recording report system where you can like literally capture what people are saying to you if it's over Xbox Live, maybe over VoIP, I'm not sure. But like, if you do something minor where you're like kind of like something like low key, then you can get suspended for like a day, or it's something fairly short, and you can get 1 strike of the 8. And then it goes away after a certain amount of time if you don't get any more. Now, the thing is that if you do things like, I believe it said that there was like, if you like threaten physical harm, if you dox people and stuff like that, then you just instantly get all 8 strikes and you're gone. And then there are things like if you're, I assume like racist and things like that, that will account there too. But then if you're like really harassing, really vulgar, you can get more than 1 strike at a time, or you can get multiple strikes for 1 interaction if you do multiple things that qualify. So this whole 8 strikes thing isn't completely accurate. It's more of like, because you have to remember that, different offenses can have different numbers of strikes. So it's probably a better system than it's been given credit for. At the end of the day, I believe stemming from a lawsuit or some kind of litigation. Xbox has really been pushing a lot of this, trying to kind of wrangle in the toxicity and awfulness that you can find in online gaming communities and stuff like that. Especially, it's one thing if you're like in a live chat with all your friends and y'all are kind of poking fun at each other and being jerks, but it's another thing when you're playing in multiplayer games and inviting like strangers to a live chat room and people are like berating you or being awful, or even if it's over VoIP on various games that have that functionality. I really think this stuff is important. The big thing they're trying to protect is kids. But no one likes to be harassed and talked down to or talked badly to. So I'm glad that they're doing this. I'm sure there's going to be naysayers who are saying that everyone's too sensitive nowadays. I don't care about that. We should be nicer to each other. So I'm glad there's something pushing for that. Okay, the second to last story is like kind of related. Actually, the two last stories are like sort of gaming related. The first one is more of a, if you've seen this around but you don't understand what's going on, is the Linus Tech Tips situation. Linus Tech Tips is a YouTube channel that's been around quite a while. It's one of, if not the biggest, tech-based YouTube channels. It's led by, it was created by Linus Sebastian, who has a long history in the kind of computer and gaming industry, mostly on the hardware side of PCs. And Linus Tech Tips has become this conglomerate, this big, channel where they have multiple shows under their umbrella. They have a Macintosh show, they have a gaming channel, they have a they have all of these like kind of specialized channels, and then they still have their kind of classic content and stuff like that. And what happened is, first they had a product sent to them that they tested incorrectly and derided the product pretty bad. And it ended up that product was the only sample product that company had. This is a kind of a small 2-person company that's making these like cooling blocks for CPUs and graphics cards. And so not only did they test it out on the wrong kind of graphic card that wasn't meant to be used on, which obviously gave it subpar results, they then gave the thing away at this big conference they hold. And so there was a bunch of controversy about that and how that was, pretty dumb. And then another tech channel called Gamers Nexus put out a video talking about that, and then also talking about how this Linus Tech Tips, their main channel does a lot of hardware reviews and supposed testing with this big like multi-$100,000 lab they've put together to try to test products and become like a good baseline for comparing products. And this Gamers Nexus video pointed out that like they're making tons of mistakes. Like they are just messing stuff up on these reviews and this testing constantly. And they're fixing some of it and they're not fixing some of it, and they're like stealth fixing some of it but never telling anyone they were originally wrong. And that blew up, and that was bad enough. And then it came out that one of the former employees, a woman who worked there for a short time, came out and basically alleged a bunch of mental abuse, even sexual harassment and like unwanted touching incidents, and that she reported a bunch of stuff to HR. But HR is Linus's wife and another employee, and that there's basically alleged that there was just a bunch of issues and that they weren't being handled very well, if at all. Linus himself has a history of putting his foot in his mouth. He says lots of dumb things and ends up having to pull him back, and then they kind of end up making jokes about him. He never fully takes anything seriously, it seems like, at least in my opinion. He's also got some kind of weird views that people don't love on. He's like very anti-union, and in that, it's where he said that if his employees ever wanted to be in a union, he would feel like he failed. Now, what he's trying to say is that he thinks that he can make working conditions good enough that people shouldn't need a union. But that's not really how these things work. And unfortunately, humans are very fallible. And even though we think we're doing the right thing, many times we often aren't. And so this whole situation led to them putting they're taking a week break from content for them to kind of look inwards and try to figure out some stuff that's going on, maybe slow down with their content pipeline. This last day, I believe, when they didn't post a video, is the first time that they haven't posted a daily video for that channel ever in many, many years. And so that's a big deal. They've even claimed that they're going to bring in an outside investigator to investigate the allegations by the ex-employee. There's mixed opinions on that it's probably just going to be like a show thing. There's probably very little evidence or anything to really gather in an investigation. It's mostly going to be for show, but it's better than nothing, maybe. It's just an interesting situation. So if you aren't a fan of Linus Tech Tips, which I wouldn't call myself a fan, but I do watch, I do like a lot of their content. I just also don't like some of the people that they have involved in that company. That kind of keeps me from being like a quote unquote fan of them. But the whole situation is very interesting, and I'm really curious to how it's going to work out for them in the long run, because they've made a lot of hiccups, but they've always recovered. But this seems like it's a bigger deal than anything that's ever happened before. So we'll have to wait and see. And then the final thing is, it's more talking about like how to get a hold of me and stuff like that. Twitter, is what I'm always going to call it. I'm never going to change. Supposedly the new ownership has decided that they are at least claiming that they are going to remove the ability to block other accounts anywhere except for DMs, direct messages. The only reason I'm still on Twitter, and while for a couple years I've really enjoyed Twitter, is because of blocks, because I was able to basically delete a bunch of really awful people that from my situation, and I've been able to pretty peacefully enjoy Twitter for years now. I've seen a lot of people say like, well, just mute people. The problem with muting on Twitter is that they can still see all your tweets. They can still reply to your tweets and say awful things. They can still quote tweet you and do all kinds of things, and you just won't see it. So you could be getting harassed and you may not know, but anyone who follows you will see it, which I think is almost worse. And so I've gone to a block only policy. I will only block people. And so if they get rid of blocks and they reverse all of that, I'm going to have a hard time being on Twitter at all. That's just my take on it, at least. So I suspect I will always be posting content to there, at least while it's active enough to justify. But I have a Blue Sky account. You can find me as Bond Diesel on there. I have a Threads account. You can find me there. I have an Instagram where I'm Bond_Diesel. Really the best place to find me is my Discord, which you can find in the Linktree link, either in the description or in the comments. And or maybe just like I post a lot of community posts over on YouTube. So if you want to chat on there, as long as you have a name I can recognize. I know Twitter is not going anywhere for a long time, and I know a lot of people are going to keep using it, including myself. But I definitely find myself logging or checking Twitter at least half as much as I used to, if not less. I hate that stupid logo. I hate that they're trying to remove any memory of what tweets were, that they existed. And then this stuff is just only getting worse. And the real bummer about this is that if they remove that, it's going to be a pain for me, because there's going to be a bunch of pieces of junk who are going to have access to me again. But even worse really is that I mostly stick around Twitter for like game dev Twitter, and I love like interacting with, or at least seeing what game devs have to say and things like that. And game devs are just going to leave Twitter in droves if this happens, because I would assume that even, in a much larger scale than myself, the only way that they've been able to stay on Twitter is by blocking people who are trolling them for games they've made or where they work or whatever. So it seems like Twitter is, I don't know if it's getting worse or better. It depends on your, subjective opinion, I suppose. But it definitely seems like it's trying to cater to an audience that I am not part of. And that's a real bummer, because there's absolutely been times where I really, really liked Twitter and got to meet some really interesting people because of it. And I just, it's interesting. So we'll have to see where that goes. But I'm all over the place, including right here on this podcast, if you want to find me. We got one listener question this week. If you have your own questions, please be sure to check out the Google form questionnaire that I post on my Twitter and over on the Discord. You can ask in the Discord any questions or propose any topics, or in the YouTube comments, or you can hit me up on any social media places that you want or can find me. This week's question comes from Master Prime. He says, do you think Xbox will launch an upgrade to the Series X or S? I think that's a good question. I think it's been really interesting seeing this conversation because, with the way that the Series S is supposedly holding back Baldur's Gate 3 from coming out on Xbox, I think there is a lot more to that story than we know about. And that's maybe a discussion we can have a different day. But the simple fact is that the Series S is a less powerful machine than the X, but we knew that from the start. The problem is that the Series S was always kind of like proposed as a 1440p console, and the X was supposed to be the 4K console. And the way things look like they're actually working out is that the Series X is going to be like the 1440p console, and that the Series S is going to be like the dynamic 720 to 1080p console. And even then, it's kind of not seemingly be able to hold up on its side of that bargain. And so it seems like, I think they have to respect all the people who bought Series S's. My assumption with that console since it came out was that it was going to be a pretty primary console to use, like the hardware of it on all of these cross-gen games that have come out over the last couple of years. But I just always assumed it was never going to be like a console that was going to continue on through the entire generation. I always kind of assumed that at some point it would utilize this supposed game streaming that Xbox is going to put out eventually. And if that doesn't make sense, right now you can stream, you can stream or do like remote console with any Game Pass game. Streaming, I think remote you can do any game that you own. The problem is that, say, like the Division 2, I don't think you can stream that just because you own it, because it's assuming it's not on Game Pass. I can't remember if it is or not. So my thought was always that like any games that the Series S couldn't run well and that it was holding back, quote unquote, would just be streamed. It's kind of like what the Nintendo Switch does. The Switch plays a lot of its games natively, but a lot of its ports, like The Witcher 3 and stuff like that. Actually, I think that game is native, but there's ports on the Switch that are played purely through streaming. I assume because Nintendo's online system is awful, and because it's not a very powerful console in the first place, the streaming experience probably isn't amazing. But the Series S is absolutely powerful enough to like stream, like 1080p streams really good, I bet. Even 2K and maybe even 4K streams okay. And so I always assumed that was the natural future for the S, that the Series X would eventually become the like middle ground console, and that before the end of the gen that they'll release like a Series X Pro that will have some, relatively boosted hardware. But who knows? I definitely think at some point they put out a more powerful console that will still be part of this current gen. All the rumors are is that there is a slim PS5 coming like really soon, and then that there's probably like a PS5 Pro coming probably next year or in early 2026. But again, people need to keep in mind that we're probably like halfway through this current gen when it comes to hardware. There's a really good chance that in 4 or 5 years, we're going to have the PS6 and whatever Xbox is going to call their next console. And so, I've predicted in the past, I think that Microsoft could stop the generation thing entirely because they do such a good job with not really having gens when it came like when you buy a new Xbox, a new gen, it doesn't leave all the games before behind. You can still play all of those, especially now with Xbox Live and Game Pass and all that. And so in theory, Xbox could perpetually just release new systems every few years and then phase out the ones that are like 2 or 3 gens behind and just do that forever and never truly have like a next gen Xbox. or maybe they will. Maybe they'll try to keep competing with PlayStation in that way, which I don't think they should. I think they lost that war a long time ago. They should be focusing on their own thing, but we'll see. So yes, I believe we will see an upgrade to those. I think we'll see an upgrade to the PS5 as well. And then we have what is presumed to be like the Switch 2, probably coming out in 2024. So there we go. And that's where I'm going to wrap this thing up. Thank you so much for listening. Again, be on the lookout for the branding change. We'll be looking at The Bonfire, a video game podcast moving forward after this week. Next week will be the 250th episode. I wanted to try to line up some interviews and stuff, but it just probably isn't going to work out. I may try to do something last minute to kind of make that episode special, but we'll see. Either way, with N7 Day coming up and stuff, I will obviously have some guests on the show probably after N7 Day. Here in a few months, especially specifically N7 Legend, to talk about what they show us and to do our speculation and all of that. There's devs on the Ubisoft Avatar game who I've invited on the show after that game comes out. I definitely think the Ubisoft Star Wars game, I will be able to get some people on, assuming that's next year. And so things are coming, and I would really love to get some Mass Effect people on here, former or current. So we'll have to see if I can pull that at some point. But yeah. You can find me all over the internet as Bond Diesel, including on Twitter, Threads, Blue Sky, YouTube, Instagram, and over on Twitch, where I try to stream a few times a week. And starting next week, should be able to stream more consistently again now that my wife is back to work and we're getting back into our normal routine. And on Tuesday, I do plan on streaming the Gamescom opening night live. I don't have high hopes for that show. I think it's going to be super boring because it always is. It's very much a Keighley show, but there could still be some cool stuff to see, and I'm willing to at least check it out. So if you want to support this channel, this podcast, all of my other content, please check out patreon.com/mondiesel. Subscribe over at Twitch, especially if you have a Amazon Prime sub that you can use every month for free. Or check out my merch at the link in the description below. That is the Linktree link. I actually think my merch looks pretty cool, even though no one ever buys it. So feel free to grab a mug or something if you want. That's all I have for this one. So until next time.